The first letter appeared on a night when I was sure I was alone. Not just alone in the archives, that Gothic stone belly of the university library where I'd spent every evening for the past 11 months, but alone in a way that felt permanent. The kind of alone that comes from losing the only person who ever understood your particular brand of obsession. My grandfather had died at this very desk, slumped over his translation of the Script of Veils, and everyone said it was the work that killed him, the madness of trying to decode a language that didn't want to be understood. I came here to prove them wrong, to finish what he started, to show them he wasn't crazy. But on that November night, when I returned from the bathroom to find crisp parchment where there had been only my scattered notes, I wondered if madness was hereditary after all. The archives were my inheritance and my prison. The university had granted me access as a courtesy to my grandfather's memory, or perhaps as an anthropological curiosity, the way you might let someone finish building a ship in a bottle to see if they'll actually do it. The room itself was a relic, dark wood paneling that drank the light from my desk lamp, shelves climbing toward vaulted ceilings, and a Gothic window that let in the moon, but little else. It smelled of leather and vanilla and something underneath that might have been time itself, if time had a scent, mildew and dust, and the particular chemical decay of ancient paper. I developed a rhythm here. Arrive at 8 p.m. when the main library closes. Make myself tea in the small kitchenette that someone had awkwardly installed in what used to be a confessional. Please return to the desk, my desk now, though it had been his for 30 years before me. Open my laptop. Arrange my reference books in a specific order. Place my phone face down where I wouldn't be tempted. Then, and only then, would I allow myself to unfold the photocopied pages of the Script of Veils. The Veils script was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. Each character looked like calligraphy had mated with geometry, producing offspring that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. My grandfather had spent his entire career arguing that it wasn't just an alphabet, but a language, a complete system of thought encoded by a 17th century scholar whose name had been lost to time. The academic community had humored him at first, then pitted him, then finally dismissed him entirely. The script appeared in only one source, a single manuscript held in the university's special collections, and most scholars believed it was either an elaborate hoax or the idle doodling of a bored monk. But my grandfather had been certain, and in his certainty, he'd found something. Patterns, repetitions, the ghost of grammar. He'd filled 47 notebooks with his translations, his theories, his increasingly desperate attempts to make the academic world see what he saw. When he died, face down on this desk at 2 a.m, the university had quietly archived his research and invited me to conclude his work in whatever way I saw fit. They meant to give up. Write a brief memorial article about his dedication, if not his success. Move on with my life. I meant to prove every single one of them wrong. On the night the first letter appeared, I'd been working on a particularly stubborn passage, a sequence of characters that seemed to repeat with slight variations across multiple pages of the original manuscript. My eyes were burning. My tea had gone cold 3 hours ago. I stood, stretched, felt my spine crack in 3 places, and walked the 30 feet to the small bathroom tucked behind the archive's main door. I was gone for maybe 5 minutes. When I returned, there was an envelope on my desk. Not near my desk, not on the chair. On the desk, positioned with geometric precision in the exact center of my workspace, equidistant from my laptop and my notebooks, as if someone had measured. The envelope was made of heavy cream paper that looked handmade, with a texture I could see even from the doorway. A red wax seal held it closed, pressed with a symbol I didn't recognize, but that made something in my chest constrict with uncomfortable familiarity. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, my hand still on the light switch, my heart doing something arrhythmic and unpleasant against my ribs. The archives were locked. I'd closed the door myself when I arrived, the same as I did every night, using the key the head librarian had given me with the grave instruction that I was to be the only person with after-hours access. The windows didn't open, hadn't opened in probably a century, and were too high to reach even with a ladder. The room had one entrance. I just walked through it. No one could have gotten in. I crossed to the desk slowly, the way you might approach a wild animal. The envelope sat there, innocent and impossible. In the low light from my desk lamp, I could see the paper had a slight shimmer, the way expensive stationery sometimes does, with threads of something metallic woven into the pulp. The wax seal was the deep red of venous blood. And across the front, in a hand so precise it looked almost printed, was my name. Not Aura Thorne, archivist, or Miss Thorne, or any formal designation. Just Aura, written in a script that made my breath stop entirely in my throat. It was written in the script of veils. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. The paper was cold, colder than the room, cold enough that it hurt slightly to hold. I turned it over and examined the seal. The symbol pressed into the wax looked like a key, or perhaps a doorway, or both at once. The kind of image that seemed to mean something significant just outside the edge of understanding. I should have called someone. Campus security, the head librarian, my friend Julian, who'd been increasingly worried about how much time I spent alone in this room. Instead, I sat down in my grandfather's chair, positioned the envelope directly under my desk lamp, and used my thumbnail to break the seal. The wax cracked with a sound like ice fracturing on a frozen lake. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the same heavy cream as the envelope, covered in the fluid characters of the Veil's script. I recognized them immediately, the same shapes my grandfather had died trying to decode, the same patterns I'd spent nearly a year attempting to understand. But these were fresh. The ink was black and slightly raised, the way genuine ink sits on paper when it's been applied with a fountain pen or a quill. I held the page close to my face and could smell it, bitter and botanical and something else. Something almost alive. My grandfather had translated 30 words of the script over 30 years. 30 words he was reasonably confident about, with another 100 or so that were educated guesses at best. I'd added perhaps a dozen more to that count in my 11 months of work. We had no grammar, no syntax, no way to determine where one word ended and another began. Translating this letter should have been impossible, but I read it as easily as if it were English. The characters seemed to rearrange themselves as I looked at them, not physically moving but shifting in my perception, their meaning becoming clear in a way that bypassed conscious thought entirely. It was like remembering something I'd always known but had temporarily forgotten, the way you might suddenly recall a dream hours after waking. The letter began, "My enduring love." I read those 3 words 7 times, each time hoping I'd mistranslated, hoping my exhaustion was making me see things that weren't there. But the meaning was clear, crystalline, impossible to misinterpret. The letter continued, and my hands grew steadier even as my world tilted sideways. The writer apologized for his long silence. He spoke of watching me work night after night, of admiring my dedication, of understanding my grief in a way no living person could. He wrote about the particular way I folded the corner of a page when I was frustrated, the gesture so small I hadn't realized I did it. He wrote about the shadow my hair cast on the desk in the lamplight, and how it reminded him of something he'd lost long ago. He signed it, Elias. I sat there for a long time after I finished reading the letter, trembling slightly in my hands, though whether from my shaking or from something else, I couldn't tell. The air in the archives had grown perceptibly colder. My breath misted faintly in the lamplight. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should be, pooling in ways that defied the single light source on my desk. The most terrifying thing wasn't the impossible appearance of the letter, or even that I could read a script I shouldn't be able to understand. The most terrifying thing was the last line, which I read again and again, each reading making my heart beat faster and my skin prickle with something that wasn't quite fear. I have waited centuries to write to you again. Not to write to you, but to write to you again. As if we'd corresponded before. As if I should remember. I looked up from the letter, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, but enough, I thought I saw something standing in the shadows near the Gothic window. A shape like a person, but not quite solid. More like the impression of a person, the way heat distorts the air. A hood, a suggestion of hands, the glint of something that might have been eyes. Then I blinked, and there was nothing there but moonlight and dust motes and the infinite, patient darkness of the archives. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself there was a rational explanation for all of this. Someone had found a way in. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. Someone wanted to drive me out of the archives the same way they'd driven my grandfather mad. But when I finally made myself look down at the letter again, at that fluid, impossible script, I knew with cold certainty that I was lying to myself. Whatever had left this letter, whoever Elias was, he wasn't bound by the same rules that governed my world. He existed in the spaces between things, in the gap between rational explanation and lived experience, in the territory my grandfather had tried and failed to map before he died at this very desk. And for some reason that terrified and compelled me in equal measure, he was writing love letters to me. I folded the letter carefully, returned it to its envelope, and placed it in the center drawer of the desk. My hands were steadier now. My breathing had returned to normal. I opened my laptop, created a new document, and began to methodically record everything that had just happened, using the same clinical language I would use for any research observation. This was just data, just another puzzle to solve, just one more impossible thing that would, eventually, reveal itself to have a perfectly rational explanation. I worked until dawn, though I didn't translate another word of my grandfather's notes. When I finally left the archives, locking the door behind me and walking out into the pale November morning, I told myself I wouldn't come back that night, that I needed distance. Perspective. Sleep. But I knew I was lying to myself about that, too. Because tucked into my coat pocket, where I could feel its cold weight against my ribs, was the envelope. And already, despite every rational instinct in my body, I was wondering what the second letter would say. Chapter 1. The Disruption. I came back the next night with a plan. I'd spent the day researching hidden cameras, micro-surveillance equipment, the kind of thing you could hide in Gothic molding. Someone was watching me. Someone had to be. The alternative was admitting that I'd inherited more than just my grandfather's obsession. I arrived early and spent an hour searching every inch of the room. I ran my hands along window frames, climbed on the desk to examine light fixtures and ceiling medallions, pulled books from shelves, checking for holes drilled through to rooms beyond, though I knew there were no rooms beyond, just solid stone from when this was a monastery 300 years ago. I found dust, a desiccated moth, and absolutely nothing that could explain the letter. The desk became my next focus. I emptied every drawer, examining them for false bottoms, hidden compartments, and any mechanism that could produce an envelope on command. But the drawers were simple pine boxes, slightly warped with age, containing nothing but old paper clips and the letter from yesterday, still cold to the touch. By 9 o'clock, I'd convinced myself I was being ridiculous. I made tea, arranged my books, and tried to focus. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing at the shadows, my ears straining for sounds that didn't belong. At 10:30, I went to the bathroom again. I left my phone on the desk, camera app open and recording, angled to capture the workspace. I walked to the bathroom, counted to 60, and walked back. The phone was exactly where I'd left it, still recording. Next to it, positioned with that same geometric precision, was another envelope. Same cream paper, same red wax seal. My name is in the script of veils, characters shimmering in the lamplight. I grabbed my phone and stopped the recording, pulled up the video and watched the empty desk, my notebooks and laptop undisturbed in the pool of lamplight. For 47 seconds, nothing changed. Then, Between one frame and the next, the envelope was simply there. No hand placing it. No shadow. One frame empty, the next occupied, as if the envelope had always existed and my phone had only just now remembered to record it. I played it again and again, until the repetition made the impossibility somehow worse, more concrete. This wasn't a trick or a prank or hidden mechanisms. This was something breaking the rules of physical reality with the casual ease of breath on glass. The envelope sat there, patient and terrible. My hand trembled as I reached for it. The video still playing, showing me that impossible moment over and over. The wax seal felt warm this time, almost body temperature, and when I broke it, the smell was more pungent, that bitter botanical scent, but underneath something else. Something like ozone after lightning. Something like the air in the archives just before my grandfather died. The second letter was longer than the first. I spread it on the desk under the lamp, my hand steadier now because I'd made a decision somewhere between the bathroom and this moment. I would treat this scientifically, document everything, translate with precision. If I were losing my mind the same way my grandfather had, at least I'd leave better notes. The characters flowed across the page in that same impossibly beautiful script, and again I could read them as easily as breathing. This shouldn't be possible. My grandfather had translated 30 words in 30 years. I had added 12 more in 11 months of exhaustive work. But sitting here with Elias's letter, the meaning arrived in my mind fully formed, the way you might remember lyrics to a song you'd forgotten you knew. My enduring love. It began again, and I felt something in my chest constrict at the intimacy of those words. Forgive my long silence. Time moves differently where I am now, and I had forgotten the weight of years until I saw you at this desk, your head bent in the same angle of concentration, your hand moving across the page in the same determined rhythm. You have his stubbornness, his brilliant, terrible need to understand what others are content to leave mysterious. I stopped reading. Reread it. You have his stubbornness could mean my grandfather. But the way it was phrased, the possessive intimacy of it, suggested something else, as if Elias had known him. As if they'd spoken. The letter continued, describing things no one should know. The way I tapped my pen 3 times against my lips when I was thinking. I always made my tea too hot, and then forgot about it until it was cold. The slight sound I made, almost a sigh, when I finally solved a challenging passage. Details so specific and mundane that they felt more invasive than if he'd described me naked. I have loved you across more years than you can imagine, the letter said near the end. I have waited in this in-between place, neither alive nor fully gone, sustained only by the hope that you would return to me. And now you are here, working at the same desk where we once worked together, though you do not remember. You cannot remember. That is the cruelty of the veil between us. The letter ended with an apology for frightening me, for the impossibility of his existence, for loving me so thoroughly when I did not yet know him. He signed it again, Elias. I sat there for a long time after finishing the letter, trembling slightly in my hands. Then I opened my laptop and began to search. I'd read everything about the Veil's script during my research, every academic paper, every dismissive footnote. But I'd been looking for linguistic patterns, grammatical structures, evidence of authenticity. I hadn't been looking for stories about the person who created it. It took me 3 hours of digging through digitized monastery records, footnotes in obscure theological texts, and the kind of academic gossip that gets buried in dissertation appendices nobody reads. But I found him. Or rather, I found the legend of him. Elias. No last name recorded. A scholar at this monastery in 1654, brilliant and obsessive, who'd been developing a new form of writing he claimed could encode not just words but emotions, memories, the texture of human experience itself. The records described him as a genius and possibly mad, the way records always tell people who see too clearly. He'd disappeared one winter night, and the manuscript he'd been working on, the only example of his complete script, had been found on his desk, still wet with ink. Nobody was ever recovered. The church had quietly declared him dead and sealed his work away as possibly heretical. My hands were shaking again as I pulled up the scanned images of the original Vale's manuscript, the one my grandfather had spent his life trying to decode. I'd looked at these pages hundreds of times, but I'd never paid attention to the marginalia, the small notes in Latin that I'd assumed were later additions. Now I zoomed in and began to translate them. He wrote this in his final days. One note read. He claimed he could hear voices from beyond the veil between worlds. He claimed he was writing to someone he'd lost, someone he would find again. Another note, in different handwriting, possibly decades later. The script cannot be translated by conventional means. It responds only to those it was written for. I closed my laptop. Outside the Gothic window, the moon had set, and the false dawn was turning the sky the color of a bruise. The letter sat on my desk, innocent and impossible. In my mind, I could still hear his voice, reading those words. I have loved you across more years than you can imagine. My grandfather had died at this desk, trying to translate a script that responded only to those it was written for. And I'd come here thinking I could finish his work through sheer rationality and determination. But what if he hadn't been trying to translate it at all? What if he'd been trying to answer it? The letters came every night after that. I'd find them in different places now, as if he were learning the geography of my routine. One appeared tucked between the pages of the book I'd been reading, marking the exact passage where I'd stopped. Another materialized inside my closed notebook, the ink still wet enough to smell. A third I discovered folded into the precise origami shape of a bird, sitting on the windowsill where the moonlight would catch it. Each letter was an inventory of my existence, catalogued with the devotion of someone who had nothing else to study. He described the way I folded the corner of a page when I was frustrated, creasing it twice before smoothing it flat again with my thumb. The shadow my hair cast across the desk when I leaned forward, how it moved like water in the lamplight. The specific rhythm of my footsteps as I paced the archives, trying to work through a difficult translation. 12 steps to the window. Turn, 12 steps back. You bite your lower lip when you're uncertain. One letter read. Just the left side. Your grandfather did the same thing. I watched him do it for 30 years, and each time it reminded me of you, though I had not yet seen you in this life. Time is not linear where I am. I have known you before you were born. I will know you after you've forgotten me. The intimacy of it should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself becoming conscious of my own movements, performing them with more intention, knowing he was watching. I started choosing which books to read based on which would look most elegant in the lamplight. I wore my hair down instead of pulled back, small vanities for an invisible audience. On the 5th night, I left my first note for him. I told myself it was purely academic, an attempt to gather more data about the phenomenon. I wrote in English on a simple index card, questions phrased with clinical detachment. What are you? How do you perceive time? What do you want from me? I placed it beneath the base of my lamp where I'd seen the cold air gather most intensely and went to make tea. When I returned, the card was gone. In its place was an envelope. I am what remains when love refuses to end. His response began. I perceive time the way you might perceive a room, all of it visible at once, past and future equally present. And what I want is impossible, to touch your hand, to speak to you without the barrier of paper, to remind you of what you've forgotten. I wrote back that same night, then the next, and the next. My questions became less clinical, my phrasing less careful. I asked about his disappearance, about the script he'd created, about my grandfather. He answered everything with a patience that felt ancient, his words arriving as fast as I could leave my notes, as if he'd been waiting centuries for someone to ask finally. The archives grew colder with each exchange. I started wearing my coat while I worked, my breath misting in the lamplight. The cold seemed to concentrate around my desk, around the space where I left my notes. Once, I placed my hand flat on the wooden surface where a letter had just appeared, and the wood was ice cold, cold enough to burn. When I pulled my hand away, there was frost in the shape of my palm, melting slowly in the warm air. Can you see me right now? I wrote one night, my handwriting less steady than usual. I placed the note in our usual spot and didn't move away. Just sat there, watching the paper, waiting. The air around the note began to shimmer, like heat waves, but cold. The paper lifted slightly, not from any breeze, but as if invisible fingers were lifting it. I watched it fold itself, once, twice, 3 times, with geometric precision. Then it unfolded again, and new words had appeared beneath my question, written in that impossible script I could somehow read. Always, it said, I am always watching you. You are the only thing in any world that I can still see clearly. My breath caught. The cold air pressed against my skin like a touch, and for just a moment, I swore I felt something brush against my cheek, gentle as a whisper, gone before I could turn my head. I should have left then, should have gathered my things and never come back. But I reached for another index card instead, and my hand was steady as I wrote. Tell me what I've forgotten. The letter that arrived 3 nights later was different, heavier. The wax seal was darker, almost black, and when I broke it, the paper inside felt damp, as if it had been held in someone's trembling hands. I unfolded it slowly, and the first line made my throat close. Your grandfather spoke your name before he died. I stopped breathing. The words blurred, and I had to blink several times before I could continue reading. No one had been with him when he died. That was what the university had told me, what the night security guard had confirmed. He'd been found at dawn, slumped over this desk, cold for hours. Alone, always alone in his obsession. He called for you in those final moments. The letter continued. Not for help. He was beyond that. But he wanted you to know that he'd found it. The truth he'd been searching for. He said your name 3 times, like a prayer, and then he said, tell her I wasn't mad. Tell her it was real. Tell her to finish it. I was the only one listening. I am always the only one listening in this place. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to set the letter down on the desk. I'd been 18 when he died, away at college, ignoring his increasingly frantic calls because I was embarrassed by him, by his obsession, by the way other professors would lower their voices when they mentioned his name. That particular tone of pity mixed with disdain reserved for academics who'd lost the plot. I'd stopped answering his calls 2 months before he died. The last message he'd left was 7 minutes long, rambling and excited about a breakthrough, and I deleted it without listening to the end. The guilt had been easy to bury under practicality. Under the work of clearing out his apartment, organizing his papers, nodding sympathetically when the department chair suggested perhaps his research should be respectfully archived rather than published. I told myself I was being rational, mature, moving forward. He knew you were angry with him, Elias's letter said, as if he could read my thoughts across time and death. He understood. He'd made the same choice once, turned away from someone he loved because the truth was too strange, too impossible to bear. That's why he understood the script when no one else could. Grief is the only translator that works. I had to stand up, walk to the window, press my forehead against the cold glass, and try to remember how to breathe normally. Outside, the campus was dark except for scattered streetlights, and I could see my reflection ghosted in the window. Behind me, the archives stretched into shadow, and for just a moment I thought I saw another reflection in the glass. A hooded figure, tall and still, watching me from across the room. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the desk lamp's circle of light and the darkness pressing in from all sides. How do you know this? I wrote on a fresh card, my handwriting barely legible. How could you possibly know what he said? The response came faster than usual, appearing before I'd even finished placing the card down. Because I held him while he died. I couldn't touch him, couldn't warm him, couldn't do anything but listen and watch and wait. The same way I've been waiting for you. The same way I'll wait for as long as it takes. I picked up the letter again, reading it through tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. There was more, details no one should know. The way my grandfather had arranged his papers before he died, squaring them with obsessive precision. The half-finished cup of tea that had grown cold beside him. The fact that his last written words, scrawled in the margin of his notebook, were "She'll understand. Tell her she'll understand." He wasn't mad, Elias wrote. He was closer to the truth than anyone living. And he died knowing that you would finish what he started, that you would come here and sit at this desk and finally understand what he'd been trying to tell you all along. That love doesn't end. It just changes form. It waits. I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others in the desk drawer. My face was wet and my chest hurt, and I couldn't tell anymore if I was mourning my grandfather or mourning something I couldn't quite remember losing. Outside the window, dawn was still hours away. I sat back down at the desk, pulled out a fresh card, and wrote 4 words. "I'm sorry I left." The reply came instantly, appearing on the card itself, the letters forming as I watched. "You didn't. You never could." I stopped going to my apartment. There was no point. Sleep was impossible anyway, and the hours I might have spent staring at Grace's old ceiling were better used here, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, searching for proof that I wasn't losing my mind the way everyone assumed my grandfather had. The university's special collections occupied the floor below the archives, a climate-controlled vault that required 3 separate permissions to access. I'd been avoiding it, telling myself my research didn't require original sources, that the digitized manuscripts were sufficient. But now I needed more than translations. I needed context, history, evidence that Elias had existed as something more than ink and impossible paper. The head archivist, Dr. Chun, gave me a long look when I requested access to the monastery records from the 1650s. "Most of those are in Latin," she said, "and the handwriting is nearly illegible." "I know," I said. "I need them anyway." She studied me for another moment, and I wondered what she saw. Probably the same thing everyone had seen in my grandfather toward the end. The obsessive focus, the dark circles under the eyes, the particular intensity of someone who'd stopped caring about anything except the truth. She handed me the access card without another word. The records were kept in acid-free boxes, each one labeled with dates and brief descriptions. I started with 1650 and worked forward, my Latin rusty but adequate. Most entries were mundane. Inventories of books acquired, records of donations, lists of visiting scholars. But in a ledger dated November 1654, I found the first mention. Elias, scribe, arrived from Prague. No surname given. Recommended by Brother Thomas for his knowledge of ancient languages and mathematical theory. Assigned to the scriptorium for transcription work. My heart was beating faster as I pulled the next box, dated 1655. More mentions of Elias, scattered through various records. He'd transcribed 12 manuscripts that year. He'd requested unusual materials, specific inks, rare papers, tools for creating his own writing implements. One note, in a different hand, complained that he worked only at night and had requested his workspace be moved to the most isolated room in the monastery. This room. He'd worked in this room. The entries became more frequent and more concerned as the months passed. Elias refuses visitors to his workspace, claims to be developing a new form of notation. The scribe's behavior grows increasingly erratic. He speaks to the air and insists someone answers. Brother Marcus reports that Elias weeps while working, though when questioned claims he is not sad, but rather listening to something beautiful that no one else can hear. I turn the pages carefully, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. The final entry was dated December 15th, 1654. Elias found this morning in the North Scriptorium, his workspace arranged with precision, his final manuscript laid open on the desk. No sign of struggle or illness. The body simply ceased, as if the soul departed mid-sentence. His last words, according to Brother Thomas, who heard him through the door near midnight. I will wait. I will wait until time circles back. I will wait until you remember. The manuscript he left behind is written in a script none can decipher. The abbot has declared it potentially heretical and ordered it sealed. I sat back, the record book heavy in my lap. The date of his death, December 15th. I pulled out my phone and checked the calendar, counting backwards. My grandfather had died on December 15th, exactly 370 years later, to the day. My hands were shaking as I pulled another box, this one labeled Sealed Documents, Ecclesiastical Review. Inside were papers I shouldn't have access to, documents that required higher clearance than my card provided. But Dr. Chun was at lunch, and the vault was empty, and I was far past caring about protocol. The manuscript was there, preserved in layers of protective film, the same one that had been digitized for my grandfather's research. But surrounding it were letters, dozens of them, written in Elias's hand. Not in the Vale script, but in Latin, addressed to someone named Aura. My name, written in 1654. My beloved Aura. The first letter began. I know you cannot read this yet. I know you are not yet born, that centuries must pass before you sit at my desk and find these words. But time is not a line, my love. It is a circle, and we have walked it before. When you read this, you will not remember. The veil between lives is too thick. But I remember. I remember everything. Your laugh. The way you would bite your lip when you were uncertain. The exact shade of your eyes in candlelight. I remember the life we built together before this one, and I remember the moment I lost you. I will not lose you again. I am encoding everything we were into this script, binding it to time itself, creating a language that only you can read because it was written in the shape of your soul. Wait for me. I am already waiting for you. The letter was signed with the same simple Elias that appeared on every impossible envelope that had materialized on my desk. After I found the letters in the vault, something shifted between us. Or maybe something shifted in me. I stopped pretending this was research and started admitting it was something else entirely. Something I didn't have a word for yet. His letters became more intimate, less careful. He wrote about the way exhaustion sat in my shoulders, how I'd started hunching forward over the desk, as if I could physically push myself closer to understanding. He noticed when I forgot to eat, when I made tea and left it untouched until it formed a film on the surface. He saw the hope that flickered across my face when I solved a difficult passage, and the deeper despair that followed when I realized how much further I still had to go. You're working yourself to dust, one letter said. The way your grandfather did. The way I did at the end. But you don't have to do this alone. Let me help you. I know this script better than I know my own name. It's the only thing I have left. I wrote back asking how he could possibly help when he couldn't even touch the pages I was working on. His response appeared within seconds, the letters forming on my note card as if written by an invisible hand. Look at manuscript page 47, third symbol from the left in the second line. It's not what your grandfather thought. It's not a verb at all. It's a modifier that changes the meaning of everything that follows. Start there. I pulled up the digitized manuscript with shaking hands. Page 47. The symbol he'd mentioned. My grandfather had spent 2 years trying to parse that particular passage, had filled an entire notebook with failed translations. But if Elias was right, if that symbol was a modifier rather than a verb, then the entire structure of the sentence changed. The meaning inverted. What my grandfather had read as time moves forward would actually mean time returns. I worked through the night, following Elias's guidance. He'd leave hints in his letters, small corrections, gentle redirections when I went down the wrong path. By dawn, I translated more of the script than my grandfather had managed in years. The words were starting to make sense, not just as isolated fragments, but as a complete thought, a continuous narrative. It was a love letter. The entire manuscript was a love letter, encoded across hundreds of pages, describing a love that transcended death and time and the basic physics of existence. A love so complete that the person writing it had been willing to trap himself between worlds just to wait for the beloved to return. Is this about us? I wrote one night, my handwriting barely legible from exhaustion. Did we really know each other before? You asked the wrong question, his response read. It's not about whether we knew each other. It's about whether you're willing to remember. The progress I was making should have thrilled me. This was what I'd come here for, to finish my grandfather's work, to prove the script was real and translatable and meaningful. But instead I felt increasingly unmoored, as if the solid ground of my rational world was dissolving beneath my feet. The archives no longer felt like a room I was working in. It felt like a space I was sharing, every corner occupied by his invisible presence. I'd catch myself talking aloud as I worked, narrating my thought process the way you might if someone were sitting across from you. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like breath that wasn't mine, or feel the air shift as if someone had just walked past, though when I looked up, I was always alone. Alone, but not lonely. That was the terrifying part. For the first time in the years since my grandfather's death, I didn't feel the crushing isolation that had driven me here night after night. I felt accompanied, witnessed, understood in a way that made my chest ache with something that might have been longing or might have been fear. I started leaving the archives only when the sun was fully up, when the building filled with the sounds of normal people doing normal work. In daylight, I could almost convince myself that the letters were a delusion, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that there was a rational explanation I just hadn't found yet. But then night would fall again, and I'd return to the archives, and there would be a new letter waiting. And the truth was, I didn't want it to stop. I didn't want rational explanations. I wanted him to keep writing to me, keep seeing me, keep making me feel less alone even as I grew more terrified of the empty space around me that wasn't empty at all. Julian showed up at my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, which meant he'd been worried long enough to overcome his natural respect for boundaries. I opened the door to find him standing there with takeout containers and the expression of someone preparing for an intervention. "You look terrible," he said, pushing past me into the apartment I hadn't properly occupied in weeks. "When's the last time you slept? Or ate something that wasn't vending machine coffee?" I couldn't remember, so I didn't answer. Julian set the food on the counter and turned to face me with his arms crossed, the way he used to stand when we were graduate students together and he'd caught me pulling my third all-nighter in a row. "Aura, talk to me. Everyone's worried. You're not answering emails. You're not coming to the department seminars. And Dr. Chun says you've been spending every night in the archives. Alone." He said the last word carefully, the way you might say drinking or gambling. "I'm working," I said. "I'm close to finishing the translation. My grandfather was right about everything, Julian. The script is real. It's complete. It's—" "Stop." He held up a hand. "Just stop. I've heard this before. From him. Right before he died at that desk you're so obsessed with." His voice softened. "Come with me tonight. Let me see what you're working on. Maybe I can help, or at least keep you company so you're not." "I'm not alone," I said, and the words came out more defensive than I'd intended. Julian's expression shifted to something like pity. "Aura, you are. You're very, very alone, and I think you need to step back from this before." "Fine," I interrupted. "Come tonight. See for yourself." I'd meant it as a challenge, but as soon as the words left my mouth, something cold settled in my chest. A feeling like betrayal, though I couldn't say who I was betraying or why it mattered. We arrived at the archives at 8, Julian talking nervously about nothing, department gossip, a paper he was writing, the weather. I unlocked the door and let him inside, flipping on the overhead lights instead of just my desk lamp. The room looked different, flooded with fluorescent brightness. Smaller, more ordinary, just a room full of old books and dust. "So this is it," Julian said, looking around. "Where the magic happens." I didn't answer. I was staring at my desk, at the empty space where a letter should have been waiting. There was always a letter waiting when I arrived. Always. But the desk was bare except for my laptop and notebooks. exactly as I'd left them that morning. "Show me what you've been working on," Julian said, settling into the chair across from mine, the one I'd started thinking of as Elias's chair even though no one ever sat there. I pulled up the manuscript files and walked him through my translations, trying to ignore the growing tightness in my throat. The hours passed, Julian asking questions, making suggestions, his presence filling the room in a way that felt wrong, like wearing someone else's clothes. The air remained stubbornly warm. No letters appeared. No cold spots. No sense of anyone listening except Julian, who was looking at me with increasing concern. "This is good work," he said finally, around midnight. "Really good. But Aura, there's nothing here that suggests, it's just a manuscript. An interesting one, but there's no evidence of anything supernatural or—" "You should go," I said abruptly. "What? Please. Just go. I need to work, and I can't." I stopped, unsure how to finish that sentence. Julian stood slowly, gathering his things with the careful movements of someone trying not to spook a frightened animal. "Okay, but promise me you'll call someone. A therapist, maybe, or just a friend. Someone who isn't a 400-year-old dead guy." He meant it as a joke, but his voice cracked on the last word. I walked him to the door and locked it behind him, listening to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Then I turned back to the empty archives and felt tears burning in my eyes. The letter appeared the moment I sat down at my desk. It was already there, somehow, as if it had been waiting for Julian to leave before revealing itself. "I understand why you did it," the letter began, and my hands were shaking as I read. "You wanted proof that I'm real, that you're not imagining this. You wanted a witness to confirm that you're not losing your mind the way they all think you are. But love, my dearest love, this was only ever meant for you. No one else can see these letters because no one else is you. No one else carries the shape of the soul I've been waiting for. Bringing him here was like trying to show someone else your dreams." Of course he saw nothing. Of course the room stayed silent. "I speak only to you. I have only ever spoken to you." I read it 3 times, and each time felt more like an accusation than the last. Not angry, but sad. Disappointed in a way that cut deeper than anger ever could. "I'm sorry," I wrote on a fresh card, my handwriting barely legible through tears. "I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I tried to prove you to someone else." The response came instantly. "Don't apologize for being frightened. Apologize for thinking you could share this. What we have exists in the space between worlds, in the silence between heartbeats. It's ours alone. It always has been." He appeared on the 13th night after Julian left, when the moon was full enough to flood the archives with silver light, and I'd stopped sleeping entirely. I was working at the desk, translating the final pages of the manuscript, when the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath crystallize in the air. I looked up, and he was there, not gradually materializing, not fading into view like fog, but simply present, as if he'd been standing by the window all along, and I'd only just now remembered to notice. A figure draped in robes that seemed woven from moonlight itself, the fabric moving in a wind I couldn't feel. The hood shadowed most of his face, but I could see the glow of his eyes, twin points of light that held centuries of patience and something that might have been pain. In his hands, he held a stack of letters, hundreds of them, bound with a ribbon that looked like it had been made from starlight or spider silk or something that had no name in my world. "Elias," I whispered, and my voice sounded strange in the cold air, like I was speaking underwater. "Aura." His voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my chest rather than my ears. It was the voice I'd been hearing in my head when I read his letters, but richer, deeper, textured with an ache that made my throat tight. "You've nearly finished the translation." It wasn't a question. I nodded anyway, unable to look away from him. He was beautiful in the way that distant stars are beautiful, something you could see but never touch, whose light had traveled impossible distances just to reach your eyes. "The script," I managed to say. "It's a love letter. All of it. You wrote it for someone you lost. I wrote it for you." He moved closer, and I could see the way the moonlight passed through him, the way he was both solid and not, present and absent at the same time. "I've been writing it for you across 400 years, encoding everything I remember about us into a language that only you could read. Because love doesn't forget, Aura. Bodies forget. Minds forget. But love remembers everything." "I don't remember," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "I don't remember any life before this one. I don't remember you." "I know." He stopped a few feet from my desk, close enough that I could see the way his form wavered slightly at the edges, like heat distortion. "The veil between lives is thick. But you feel it, don't you? The recognition. The reason you could read my letters when your grandfather spent 30 years trying and failing. The reason you came here night after night, even when it frightened you. Some part of you remembers." I stood slowly, my legs shaking. "What do you want from me?" "I want to give you a choice." He held up the stack of letters, and even from where I stood I could see they were written in the veil's script, every page covered in those beautiful, impossible characters. These contain the final translation. Everything your grandfather was trying to find. The complete truth of what the script says, what I've been trying to tell you across centuries. The knowledge you came here seeking. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. What's the choice? The truth can only be known by those who exist outside the bonds of time. To read these letters, to understand the final message, you must step across the veil. You must join me here, in this place between worlds, where love persists and time is a circle rather than a line. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was infinitely gentle. You would have to leave your life behind. Your body would remain. But you, your soul, your consciousness, everything that makes you you, would be here with me. Forever. The word hung in the cold air between us. Forever. Not the metaphorical forever of wedding vows, but actual, literal forever. An eternity spent in the spaces between moments, visible to no one, touching nothing, existing only in the company of this beautiful, impossible ghost who claimed to have loved me across multiple lifetimes. And if I refuse? My voice was barely a whisper. Then you remain in your world, living and breathing and aging and eventually dying the way all humans do. You'll never know what the letters say. You'll never remember what we were. And I'll wait here, the way I've been waiting, until time circles around again and brings you back to me. His eyes met mine, glowing in the shadow of his hood. I will always wait for you, Aura. In every life. In every version of time. But this life, this moment, this is the only chance for us to exist together. I looked at the letters in his hands, at the knowledge I'd been seeking for a year, the truth that had killed my grandfather and consumed me completely. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed, was contained in that stack of impossible paper. And all I had to do was die to read it. I sat back down at the desk because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. The letters in Elias's hands seemed to pulse with their own light, calling to me the way a siren's song must have called to ancient sailors. Everything I'd wanted, everything my grandfather had died trying to find. The validation, the truth, the proof that we hadn't been crazy, that the script meant something profound and beautiful and real. How long do I have to decide? I asked. Until dawn. Elias moved to the window, his form casting no shadow despite the moonlight streaming through. When the sun rises, the veil thickens again. This moment will pass, and I'll return to the space between, and you'll return to your life. The choice won't come again in this lifetime. I pulled my grandfather's notebook from the drawer, the one he'd been writing in when he died. His handwriting had grown increasingly erratic toward the end, words cramped and desperate. But on the final page, there was a single sentence, written with the careful precision of someone who knew these would be his last words. The only translation that matters is love. I thought he meant the script was about love. But now I understood. He'd been trying to tell me that love was the only thing worth translating from one world to another, from one life to the next. Everything else, the academic recognition, the proof, the validation, was just noise. Did my grandfather see you? I asked. Before he died. Yes. Elias's voice was soft with something that might have been regret. He saw me, and he understood what I was offering. But he made a different choice than you might expect. He refused. It wasn't a question. He refused because he loved you more than he loved the truth. He knew that if he crossed over, you would inherit his obsession, and he hoped. Elias paused, and I thought I heard something like emotion in his voice. He hoped you would be wiser than he was, that you would choose life over knowledge, love over truth. I laughed, and it came out broken. But here I am anyway, obsessed, alone, destroying myself the same way he did. You're not alone. Elias turned from the window to face me. You haven't been alone since the first letter appeared, and you won't be alone, regardless of what you choose now. If you stay, you'll carry the memory of this, the knowledge that something exists beyond the veil. If you come with me, you'll carry everything, every memory, every life, every version of us that's ever existed. I stood again and walked toward him, toward the letters in his hands. Up close, I could see my name written on the top envelope, in that script only I could read. My fingers reached out, trembling, stopping just inches from the paper. Tell me one thing, I said. If I take these letters, if I cross over, will I be happy? Will it be worth it? Elias was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice held 400 years of loneliness. I can give you knowledge. I can give you truth. I can give you eternity and memory and a love that transcends death itself. But happiness. His eyes met mine, glowing softly in the darkness. Happiness belongs to the living, aura. It exists in morning coffee and the warmth of sunlight and the messy, complicated, temporary beauty of being alive. I can't give you that. I can only give you forever. My hand hovered in the air between us, between the life I knew and the eternity he offered. I thought about Julian's worried face, about Grace's couch where I'd spent 3 months rebuilding myself after everything fell apart, about the morning I'd stood in this very room and decided to finish my grandfather's work, driven by grief and stubborn pride and the desperate need to prove something to people who would never care. I thought about the letters I'd received, each one a glimpse into a love so profound it had carved itself into the fabric of reality. I thought about the translations I'd completed, the breakthrough I'd achieved, the knowledge I'd gained. Wasn't that enough? Wasn't the journey toward understanding just as valuable as the destination? I need to know, I whispered, my fingers still reaching. I need to know what the letters say. I need to know if we were real. We were real, Elias said softly. We are real. This moment, right now, is as real as anything has ever been. The question isn't whether we existed. It's whether you're willing to exist only in memory. I closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I could see 2 paths branching before me like the script I'd spent a year learning to read. One path led to the letters, to knowledge, to Elias and eternity and the final truth of everything. The other led back to my desk, to my laptop, to the unfinished translation and the empty apartment and the slow, difficult work of learning to live with not knowing. When I opened my eyes again, my decision was made. I reached forward.